On a crisp autumn morning in a small Midwestern town, 82-year-old John Anderson was sorting through his late wife's belongings when he stumbled upon a faded, unopened letter addressed to him. Curious, he opened it and began to read. As his eyes scanned the words, his hands trembled and tears welled up. The letter was from a fellow soldier he had saved during the Vietnam War, a letter he had never seen until now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this incredible journey. John sat down heavily in his worn armchair, the letter trembling in his hands. The familiar scent of aged paper filled his nostrils as he began to read. Dear John, I hope this letter finds you well. I have tried to write this countless times, but never found the right words. You saved my life in Vietnam, and not a day goes by that I don't think about that moment. Your bravery and selflessness inspired me to become a doctor, dedicating my life to saving others as you saved me. I am forever grateful. With deepest thanks, David Miller. Memories long buried surged to the forefront of John's mind. The dense jungles of Vietnam, the cacophony of gunfire, the cries of the wounded. He remembered David, a young soldier trapped under debris after an ambush. Without hesitation, John had risked his own life to pull him to safety. They had lost touch after the war, each returning to their separate lives. John Anderson had always been a man of few words. After returning from the Vietnam War, he settled in his hometown, a quaint Midwestern community where everyone knew each other. He married his high school sweetheart, Mary, and together they raised 2 children. John worked as a mechanic at the local garage, a job he held until his retirement. To the townspeople, he was the friendly old man who could fix anything, always ready with a warm smile and a helping hand. Despite his approachable demeanor, John kept his past locked away. He never spoke of his time in Vietnam, not even to his family. The war was a chapter he had closed, or so he thought. The memories were too painful, the losses too great. He believed that by burying the past, he could protect himself and his loved ones from the horrors he had witnessed. The small town of Millbrook, Ohio, was the kind of place where time seemed to move slowly. Main Street was lined with family-owned businesses that had been there for generations. The local diner served the same menu for 30 years, and the barbershop still had the original red and white pole from 1952. It was a place where everyone knew your name, your family history, and what you had for breakfast. John's house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-story home with a white picket fence and a garden that Mary had lovingly tended for decades. The roses she planted still bloomed each spring, a living reminder of her presence. The garage behind the house was John's sanctuary, filled with tools, spare parts, and the lingering scent of motor oil. Even in retirement, neighbors would bring their cars to him, knowing that John's work was always reliable and fairly priced. The community respected John for his integrity and work ethic, but they saw him as a simple man with a simple life. They had no idea that beneath his quiet exterior lay the heart of a warrior who had faced unimaginable challenges in the jungles of Southeast Asia. To them, he was just John the mechanic, the widower who lived alone and kept to himself. It was a chilly October morning when John decided to clean out the attic. Mary had passed away the previous year, and the house felt emptier without her. As he sifted through boxes of old photographs, letters, and keepsakes, he stumbled upon a small, unmarked box. Inside, he found a stack of letters, all unopened, all addressed to him. Curiosity piqued, John sat down and began to read. The first letter was dated June 1970 from a man named David Miller. As he read, John's hands began to tremble. David was a fellow soldier he had served with in Vietnam. The letter was a heartfelt expression of gratitude, thanking John for saving his life during a particularly brutal firefight. David recounted how, during an ambush, John had risked his own life to pull him to safety, administering first aid and staying by his side until medics arrived. He wrote about how that act of bravery had inspired him to become a doctor, dedicating his life to saving others, just as John had saved him. John was overwhelmed. He had no memory of receiving these letters. Had Mary intercepted them? Had he been too traumatized to open them at the time? Questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was clear. His past was reaching out to him, demanding to be acknowledged. As he continued reading, more stories emerged. Letter after letter from soldiers whose lives he had touched. Some thanked him for medical aid, others for his leadership during difficult missions. One letter was from a soldier's mother expressing her gratitude for John's kindness to her son during his final moments. Each letter painted a picture of a man John barely recognized, a hero who had made a difference in countless lives. The letters had been carefully preserved, each one folded neatly and stored in chronological order. Mary must have known about them, must have kept them safe all these years. Perhaps she had been waiting for the right moment to share them with him, or perhaps she understood that he needed time to heal before he could face his past. The discovery of the letters stirred something within John. Memories he had long suppressed began to surface. He remembered the jungles of Vietnam, the camaraderie among soldiers, the fear, the loss, and the moments of unexpected heroism. One memory stood out: the day he saved David Miller. It was during a routine patrol when their unit was ambushed. Bullets rained down and chaos ensued. John spotted David, wounded and exposed. Without hesitation, he ran through the hail of gunfire, reaching David and dragging him to cover. He applied pressure to David's wound, talking to him, keeping him conscious until help arrived. John had always dismissed his actions as simply doing his duty. He never considered himself a hero. But reading David's words made him realize the profound impact of that day, not just on David's life, but on his own. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. He remembered the heat and humidity of the Vietnamese jungle, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the bonds forged between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. He recalled the faces of his fellow soldiers, some who made it home and others who didn't. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a young soldier from Texas who carried pictures of his girlfriend and talked about their wedding plans. John remembered holding Tommy's hand as he died from shrapnel wounds, promising to write to his family. There was Sergeant Williams, a career soldier who had become a father figure to the younger men in the unit. John had watched him fall during a mortar attack, his last words a message for his wife and children. These memories, buried for so long, now demanded attention. John realized that in trying to forget the pain, he had also forgotten the bonds of brotherhood, the acts of courage, and the profound sense of purpose that had defined his service. For days, John wrestled with the decision to share the letters. He had spent decades keeping his past hidden, believing it was best left forgotten. But the letters had awakened something in him, a desire to connect, to share, to heal. He decided to confide in his neighbor, Michael Reynolds, a young history teacher at the local high school. Michael had always been fascinated by the stories of veterans and had a deep respect for their experiences. Over coffee, John showed Michael the letters. As Michael read, his eyes widened. He was moved by the story and saw an opportunity to educate his students about the personal sacrifices made during the Vietnam War. "John, this is incredible," Michael said. "Would you be willing to share your story with my class?" "I think it's important for them to hear firsthand accounts." John hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a classroom recounting his experiences was daunting. But he also felt a sense of duty to honor the memory of those he had served with and to ensure their stories were not forgotten. Michael was in his early 30s, passionate about history and dedicated to his students. He had grown up hearing stories about Vietnam from his uncle, who had served 2 tours and struggled with PTSD for years afterward. Michael understood the complexity of the war and the challenges faced by veterans returning home to a divided nation. He had been teaching for 5 years and had always tried to make history relevant to his students' lives. He invited guest speakers, organized field trips to historical sites, and encouraged his students to interview elderly community members about their experiences. But he had never had the opportunity to bring a Vietnam veteran into his classroom. "I understand if you're not ready," Michael said gently, "but I think your story could have a profound impact on these kids. They need to understand that history isn't just dates and events, it's about real people who made real sacrifices." A week later, John found himself standing in front of a group of high school students. The room was silent as he began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke of his enlistment, the journey to Vietnam, the friendships forged in the heat of battle, and the horrors they faced daily. He recounted the day he saved David Miller, the fear he felt, and the instinct that drove him to act. As he spoke, he noticed the students leaning forward, hanging on his every word. They asked questions, eager to understand the complexities of the war and the personal toll it took on those who served. "I was 19 when I was drafted," John began, his voice quiet but clear. "I had just graduated high school and was planning to go to college. But the war had other plans for me." He described the training at Fort Benning, the long flight to Southeast Asia, and the shock of arriving in a country torn apart by conflict. He talked about the heat, the humidity, and the constant threat of enemy fire. "We were just kids," he continued. "Most of us had never been away from home, never seen violence like that. But we had each other, and that made all the difference." The students listened intently as John described the bonds formed between soldiers. He talked about how they looked out for each other, shared their fears and hopes, and found moments of joy even in the darkest circumstances. "One night we were sitting around a small fire, and Tommy Rodriguez started singing," John remembered, a slight smile crossing his face. "He had this beautiful voice, and soon we were all singing along. For a few minutes, we forgot where we were and what we were facing." But John didn't shy away from the difficult parts of his story. He talked about the fear, the loss, and the moral complexities of war. He described watching friends die and the guilt that came with surviving when others didn't. "The hardest part wasn't the fighting," he said. "It was coming home and trying to make sense of it all. We were told we were heroes, but we didn't feel like heroes. We were just young men who did what we had to do." For John, the experience was cathartic. Sharing his story lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. He felt a connection to the younger generation, a bridge between the past and the present. Word of John's classroom visit spread throughout the town. The local newspaper ran a story about his heroism, and soon the community rallied to honor him. The town organized a Veterans Day ceremony, dedicating a plaque in John's honor at the town square. During the ceremony, David Miller, now a renowned surgeon, made a surprise appearance. He spoke of John's bravery and the profound impact it had on his life. "John didn't just save my life," David said, his voice breaking. "He gave me a purpose. Everything I've accomplished is because of him." The crowd erupted in applause, many with tears in their eyes. John stood humbly, overwhelmed by the recognition and the outpouring of love from his community. David had flown in from California, where he ran a successful practice specializing in trauma surgery. He had built his career on the foundation of John's selfless act, dedicating his life to saving others just as John had saved him. "I've performed thousands of surgeries," David told the crowd. "I've saved countless lives. But none of it would have been possible without the courage of this man standing beside me." The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including veterans from multiple conflicts, local officials, and families from throughout the region. The mayor presented John with a key to the city, and the American Legion Post honored him with a special recognition. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a group of John's former students approached him after the ceremony. They had been inspired by his story and had decided to start a project documenting the experiences of local veterans. "Mr. Anderson," one student said, "you've taught us that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's something that lives on through the people who experienced it." In the weeks that followed, John found a new sense of purpose. He began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, offering support and sharing his experiences with fellow veterans. He also continued speaking at schools, ensuring that the stories of those who served were remembered and honored. The letters he had discovered became a symbol of the connections forged in the most challenging of times. They reminded him that even in the darkest moments, acts of courage and kindness could ripple through time, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. John's involvement with the Veterans Center brought him into contact with men and women from different conflicts: Korea, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He discovered that despite the different wars and different times, the experiences of veterans shared common threads: the bonds of service, the challenges of returning home, and the need for understanding and support. He started a weekly coffee group where veterans could gather and share their stories. The group grew from 3 members to more than 20, becoming a vital source of support for men and women struggling with the transition to civilian life. John has a gift. said Maria Santos, a nurse who worked at the Veterans Center. "He listens without judgment and shares his wisdom without preaching. These veterans trust him because he's been where they've been." John also began working with Michael Reynolds to develop a curriculum about the Vietnam War that would be taught in local schools. They created a program that included first-hand accounts, historical context, and discussions about the lasting impact of war on individuals and communities. "We want students to understand that war isn't just about battles and strategies," Michael explained. "It's about people, real people who made sacrifices and whose lives were forever changed by their service." John's story began to have a ripple effect throughout the community and beyond. Other veterans, inspired by his courage to share his experiences, began opening up about their own service. The town's understanding of its history deepened, and a new appreciation for the sacrifices made by its citizens emerged. The local high school established a scholarship fund in John's name, supporting students who planned to pursue careers in public service. The scholarship wasn't just about academic achievement. It was about character, integrity, and a commitment to serving others. Local businesses began displaying flags and honoring veterans in their establishments. The annual Veterans Day celebration grew from a small ceremony to a week-long festival that attracted visitors from neighboring towns. John's story also caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about Vietnam veterans. The filmmaker, Sarah Chun, had been searching for stories that showed the human side of the war and the long-term impact on those who served. John's story is powerful because it shows how one act of courage can echo through decades, Sarah explained. "It's not just about what happened in Vietnam. It's about how those experiences shaped the rest of his life and the lives of those around him." The documentary, titled Letters from the Past, premiered at the local theater and was later picked up by a national network. John's story reached millions of viewers, inspiring other veterans to share their experiences and communities to better support those who had served. As John continued to share his story, he found that the process was healing not just for him, but for others as well. Veterans who had struggled with PTSD and survivor's guilt found comfort in his words and his example. One particularly moving encounter occurred when John met Robert Kim, a Korean War veteran who had been living as a recluse for decades. Robert had been struggling with depression and had isolated himself from his family and community. "I heard your story," Robert told John during one of their coffee meetings. "It made me realize that I'm not alone in this struggle." With John's encouragement and support, Robert began attending the veterans group and eventually reconnected with his estranged children. The healing that took place wasn't just individual. It was generational, as families learned to understand and support their veteran members. John also received letters from other soldiers he had served with in Vietnam. Some had tracked him down after seeing the documentary or reading about him online. These reunions were emotional and cathartic, allowing old friends to reconnect and share their experiences. One such reunion was with James Patterson, a soldier who had served in John's unit and had been struggling with addiction for years. James credited John's example with inspiring him to seek treatment and rebuild his life. "You saved my life twice," James told John, "once in Vietnam and once now, by showing me that it's never too late to find purpose and meaning." As John entered his 80s, he began to think about legacy and how to ensure that the stories of his fellow veterans would continue to be told. He worked with the local historical society to create an oral history project, recording the experiences of veterans from multiple conflicts. The project grew into a comprehensive archive that included not just audio recordings, but photographs, letters, and artifacts from local veterans. The archive became a resource for researchers, students, and families seeking to understand their own military heritage. John also established a foundation that provided support for veterans transitioning to civilian life. The foundation offered counseling services, job training, and financial assistance for veterans and their families. John understood that coming home from war is just the beginning of a new battle, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, who served on the foundation's board. He wanted to make sure that no veteran had to fight that battle alone. The foundation's work expanded beyond the local community, partnering with national organizations to provide support for veterans across the country. John's story had become a catalyst for broader change, inspiring new approaches to veteran care and community support. John Anderson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including family, friends, former students, and fellow veterans. David Miller delivered the eulogy, speaking of John's humility, bravery, and the lasting impact he had on so many lives. "John never considered himself a hero," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "But to those of us whose lives he touched, he was the very definition of heroism. He showed us that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of that fear to help others." The funeral procession stretched for miles, with veterans from multiple conflicts serving as pallbearers and honor guards. The American Legion Post provided a 21-gun salute, and a bugler played taps as John's casket was lowered into the ground next to his beloved Mary, in the town square. The plaque dedicated to John became a place of reflection and inspiration. His story was taught in local schools, ensuring that future generations understood the sacrifices made by those who served. The letters that had started it all were donated to the National Archives, where they became part of the permanent collection documenting the experiences of Vietnam veterans. Researchers and historians would use them to better understand the human cost of war and the bonds forged between those who served. 5 years after John's passing, the town of Millbrook had been transformed. What had once been a quiet community with little knowledge of its military heritage had become a model for how communities can honor and support their veterans. The annual Veterans Day celebration continued to grow, attracting visitors from across the region. The scholarship fund established in John's name had helped dozens of young people pursue careers in public service. The Veterans Center had expanded its programs and was serving veterans from a multi-county area. Michael Reynolds, now the high school principal, made sure that John's story remained a central part of the school's curriculum. Each year, new students learned about the quiet mechanic who had been a hero all along. "John's story teaches us that heroism isn't always loud or obvious," Michael would tell his students. "Sometimes the greatest heroes are the people who live quietly among us, carrying their service and sacrifice with dignity and humility." David Miller continued his medical practice but also established a scholarship program for veterans pursuing medical careers. He never forgot the debt he owed to John and worked to ensure that other veterans had opportunities to serve their communities in meaningful ways. The documentary about John's life continued to be shown in schools and community centers across the country. It had become a powerful tool for educating people about the experiences of Vietnam veterans and the importance of supporting those who had served. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the change in how the community viewed its veterans. No longer were they seen as relics of the past, but as living repositories of history and wisdom. Their stories were actively sought out and preserved, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of freedom. John Anderson's journey from a quiet, unassuming man to a celebrated hero was a testament to the power of sharing one's story. It reminded everyone that true heroism often lies in the everyday acts of courage and kindness, and that acknowledging and honoring these stories can bring healing and unity to a community. His story also highlighted the importance of recognizing the sacrifices made by all veterans, not just those whose heroism was immediately apparent. Many veterans return home carrying invisible wounds and untold stories of service and sacrifice. John's example showed that it's never too late to honor these stories and provide the support and recognition that veterans deserve. The letters that had remained unopened for decades became a bridge between past and present, connecting a young soldier's act of courage with a lifetime of quiet service. They reminded everyone that our actions, no matter how small they may seem at the time, can have profound and lasting impacts on the lives of others. In the end, John Anderson's story was not just about one man's heroism, but about the power of community, the importance of remembrance, and the enduring bonds that connect us all. It was a reminder that history is not just about dates and events, but about real people who made real sacrifices, and that their stories deserve to be told, remembered, and honored. The small town of Millbrook, Ohio, had been forever changed by the discovery of a few old letters. But more importantly, The lives of countless individuals had been touched by the story of a quiet hero who had been living among them all along. John's legacy lived on not just in the monuments and scholarships established in his honor, but in the hearts and minds of all those who had been inspired by his example of service, sacrifice, and quiet dignity.